Hi everyone, welcome again to One Book and One Story. This week we are looking at the book of Zechariah. If you've been following along with us for the last several weeks, you know that I've been getting us prepared for the fact that we are almost to the end of the Old Testament. Zechariah is the second to the last book. We'll have Malachi that comes afterwards, so we'll be studying that next week. And then we'll have sort of a transitional time where I talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Israel between where we leave off and where we pick up with the New Testament. But for this week, we have, again, the book of Zechariah. This book is kind of to be read if you're trying to piece together the bigger story, the bigger narrative of the Old Testament. This is a good book to read with three others. If you remember, we've been kind of marching through different periods of time. In the beginning, we have the formation of God's family. That family is broken up into tribes. Those tribes are taken into slavery in Egypt. They leave slavery and wander in the wilderness with Moses. That's where they receive the law and sort of come together as one people. They enter the promised land. They have the time of judges. They go into a united kingdom under David and then Solomon, and then they break up. And all of that, of course, takes hundreds of years. They are two nations, north and south, for a few hundred years, and then the northern kingdom is taken into exile by Assyria. The southern kingdom is taken into exile by Babylon. Now, that's kind of where we pick up. So a lot of the prophets we've been reading have been talking about the expectation or the exile's beginning. We had one book of the Bible that really talked a lot about the time in Babylon, and that's the book of Daniel, and we're going to refer back to Daniel in a little bit. But now we've come out of that time. We've come out of a time that for the southern kingdom in Babylon would have lasted for 60-ish years. So that's where we stand now. And so Zechariah can be read with the book that precedes it, which is Haggai, and then can also be read with two other books that we read a while ago. Because remember, the Old Testament is not written in chronological order, but is grouped by the types of writings that they are, whether they are historical or whether they're more poetic, or they are more prophetic in terms of prophets. So the books of Haggai, which is another prophet, can be read with Zechariah because they are contemporaries. But we also look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah because they talk about the exact same period. So you can go backwards a little bit and just familiarize yourself with those two books because they're talking about the same basic period. So in Ezra and Nehemiah, at least as they start, we have them coming back from exile from Babylon and trying to reestablish Jerusalem. They start building the temple. And at some point, they get some pressure to stop that building. Some of their opponents were afraid that the people of Israel would become much stronger if their temple and their society was rebuilt. So they sort of succumbed to that pressure and then maybe got a little distracted by just trying to live their lives and reestablish themselves. And so we have a little bit of a gap, maybe 10 or 15 years, where the temple isn't being built. And then these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, are trying to encourage the people to restart. And then they finally do, a couple of years. It takes a few years for them to do that, maybe between like 520 and 516, somewhere in there. They've been back from exile now for a few decades, and now it's finally completed. So that's where we are in the bigger story. We're maybe 500 years before Jesus, but we're several hundred years from the time of David, which would have happened around like 1,000 years before Jesus. So that's just to give you kind of a basic on the timeline. So Zechariah has, I try to pull out for you the kind of unique aspects of each of these prophets, and which can be tricky because a lot of them feel like they're talking about some judgment, some hope, and a lot of what seems like God getting even, God settling the score, God finding ways to bring justice. But this one is unique for a few different reasons. First, Zechariah, again, is a contemporary of Haggai, but he is much younger than Haggai. If you were with us last week, and if you weren't, I would suggest that maybe you go back and listen to that before you listen to the rest of this. Haggai was probably an older gentleman by the time he's writing after the exile. Some of the book makes us think that maybe he was a young man, maybe a child whenever the exile occurred, and then went to Babylon and then returned. And so by the time he's writing here, he's maybe in his 70s. But Zechariah, that's not the case. Zechariah is a prophet, but he's also a priest. So that gives him a certain kind of authority in that setting. And he is someone who would have been actually born in Babylon. So if you think about the difference there, everything he's known up until this point has been in another country. Israel, even though it's his historical home, isn't where he grew up, isn't what he knows. He knows another place. And so he's coming to kind of reclaim that space, that land, not only for his people, but for himself. He's learning what it means to be there just as much as the rest of the people are. Because, of course, the vast majority of people that would have come back from Babylon didn't remember Israel. Their parents did, or maybe their grandparents did, but they themselves didn't. You can imagine, trying to connect with let's say your grandparents were born in the South in Alabama or something, but you lived your whole life here in Pennsylvania. Going back to that place, you would have to rely on things because you never experienced it. You only really experienced life here in Pittsburgh. So to connect with it, you'd have to really listen to those stories and explore and start to love the land and figure out how you are as much as part of that place as it is a part of you. And that, I think, is what Zechariah is trying to do. And his book, I think, really lends itself to finding an intense purpose and meaning for his people to be there. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So those are sort of the first things that we need to know about Zechariah, that a contemporary of Haggai after the exile, trying to encourage his people to finish God's temple, and that he was not born in Israel. So he's learning what it means to be there. The second thing is that this book is unique in the Old Testament, not by itself, but there are few writings in the Old Testament that are like this. And it's because Zechariah is spending time explaining some visions that he has. And these visions are a particular type of writing that we've seen before. We've seen them in a couple of different places. So these writings have fancy theology terms, and I'll give you the terms, but they're not terribly important. Their meaning is important, but the terms themselves are not important. So the first is that this is a apocalyptic writing. So an apocalyptic writing in the context of the Bible means that something is a revelation. Something is being revealed about what will happen, and not just in terms of something that God will do, but something that will happen in that place. Something that leads them to their predestined future. So that's the first part of it, is that apocalyptic means something that is something is being revealed, some big natural occurrence, that kind of a thing. And then the other theological, churchy word is these are eschatological writings. Again, that is really just a big word for this revelation, this apocalyptic writing is specifically looking at the end times. Not just the end of a nation or the end of something temporal, but the end of everything. And so when we think about eschatological, that's a word that starts with an E in case you're trying to look it up. Eschatological simply means the way that God will wrap up history, at least history as we know it. Will end the time that we know and will move us into something else. So this writing is in that style, with that purpose. And I'm going to highlight a couple of things without reading them through to you. But of course, my hope is that you'll read this book over the course of a week or so. That takes a little bit more time to do than Haggai. Haggai is just 2 chapters, but this one is 14 chapters. So in the Piper, in my devotions for the week, I've kind of broken that up for you. And so if you get the Piper from us, you'll know that over the last several weeks, my devotions have simply been a reading plan, a way for you to pace out how you're churning through these stories in the Old Testament. And so just at a couple chapters a day, you can easily read Zechariah from beginning to end. So I'm going to take you through kind of the basic idea of Zechariah, and then we're going to focus just for a couple minutes on one passage that, believe it or not, you will be familiar with, even though you won't know it ahead of time. But again, you may want to, as we're moving through this book, look a little bit into Ezra, Nehemiah, and Haggai. Those are the books that really connect to it. So, getting back to the type of language that this is, this apocalyptic type language, we really only see that in a couple of very particular places. The most obvious place to us, the one that probably popped in your mind as soon as I said it, is the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation, of course, at the end of the New Testament, is sort of the culmination of everything that we have seen from Eden to Jesus and through the Pauline letters, all of that kind of coming to a head in this last revelation, this last apocalyptic vision of a man named John. And it comes with not only a lot of imagery, but a lot of symbolism. And we might, when we read that, we might think, well, where did all of this imagery and things come from? How did we get this concept of what God would be doing? Are there any clues along the way as to how we got there? And in reality, there are. But you have to know sort of where to look for them. You have to spend some time in the Old Testament, which is why something like this, I think, is valuable. So if you were reading the book of Revelation, you know that the first few chapters are really a kind of a judgment and a look at 7 different churches. They're trying to be an encouragement to them to either keep doing what they're doing or to knock it off. So that's it's set within a particular context of being addressed to 7 particular churches. But then what comes with that is a revelation for all of us, for Jerusalem and the people of Israel specifically, because the book is written at a time when the Romans were destroying the temple around 70 AD. And the whole Jewish world was under siege. You know, would we survive any of this? Are we going to be wiped out by the Roman people. And so there couldn't have been a more important time for those folks to know that their eternal purpose and plan is set, that that God will care for them eternally, and that whatever they're facing in the short term that seems overwhelming will eventually be worked out. But some of the imagery and some of the concepts that we see in that book are actually spelled out pretty clearly in other places. The person who received revelation was receiving also a kind of a culmination of different revelations that were given to others before him. So some of the imagery might make us think of Moses and the plagues. If you look at Revelation, then, and I think it would be worthwhile to maybe have your thumb in Revelation as you're reading this book, just as a reference point. If you read Revelation, you see a lot of different types of imagery. Some of them are of horns and riders on horses and creatures that go beyond the norm. There's a lot of destruction and war and that sort of thing, but there's also a lot of kind of description and imagery around the Messiah and what the Messiah would be like, and how the Messiah will be revealed to the people. But a lot of the setting the stage towards that Messiah looks and feels a lot like the plagues. And if you look back to Moses, you see a lot of parallels between the kind of tribulations of the book of Revelation and what was happening in Egypt during the plagues in Moses' time. So those are two good comparison points. Excuse me. Another good comparison point is the other major apocalyptic revelation work in the Old Testament, which is the book of Daniel. Half the book of Daniel is really like the life and times of Daniel in Babylon. And then the second half of Daniel is all of this kind of apocalyptic end times, so eschatological writing about basically how the people of Israel would be saved and how eventually things would work. And you see a lot of that same imagery of a strong warrior-like Messiah who is going to make everything right. You see a lot of that same imagery in this book. Daniel has a lot of, when I say supernatural, I mean outside of the bounds of what we think of as the natural world. A lot of supernatural type creatures and images. You see a lot of parallels between the two. And of course, the book of Daniel, being set in Babylon, would not have been that far removed from what we see here in Zechariah, which is as they return from Babylon, and someone who was born in Babylon writing this book. So Zechariah adds to that kind of imagery. So we have Daniel, and we have Revelation, and we have another kind of source material for Revelation right here in Zechariah. And I'll point out a couple of images. Again, we don't have to read them or interpret all of them, but just knowing that they're there, I think, is important. So that's where a lot of Zechariah is. It's all set with the purpose of encouraging the people to finish the temple. And it's adding a sense of purpose, that they are, the people who have returned, are those who will build the stage for which the end will come. You know, they are creating and recreating the land in which God will resolve all things. It's adding a sense of purpose, and I think for Zechariah, it's also adding a sense of place, that he can connect with this land that he's in, that he now calls home, knowing that what they build now has a huge sense of purpose, not just for them, but a kind of eternal purpose. And so that's what Zechariah is doing. So just to kind of give you a sense of where we are. So he's encouraging the people to rebuild the temple just as Haggai did. And he's spending some time in the first couple of chapters doing that. And then he sort of starts into this revelation that ultimately gets us towards a eternal messianic king, right? And we are very familiar as Christians with that concept. An eternal king that we know as Jesus, who reigns forever and ever. The Messiah, the Christ. That's who we know him to be. The person that you and I know as Jesus is certainly not what people at that time would have assumed they were getting. And you've heard me talk about that the concept of Messiah several times, if you've done anything with us in terms of learning. I show you many places in the Old Testament where messiahs are talked about, and they're usually warriors, they're emancipators, they are king-like, they come with titles, lineage, they are obvious kind of characters. And that's a little bit of what we see here, but we also see some things that really do pivot towards connecting the dots around Jesus being that. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we get there. But when we move into thinking about Jesus, a poor carpenter's son from the sticks who somehow becomes this messianic figure, even though he held no titles and wasn't leading a charge of revolution and violence like people assumed that the Messiah would. This book of Zechariah tries to kind of connect the dots. And so if you were a contemporary of Jesus, or you were someone who came after him, and you wanted other Jewish readers or Jewish followers who were trying to figure out if they could hang their hat on the concept of Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah, a book like Zechariah kind of helps with that, but we'll get there. So that's kind of the setting. So here's a little bit of where we start with, in chapter 3, we start with this revelation. And I'm just going to read to you just sort of some of the subheadings. As he's thinking about this kind of end time figure who would free his people, who would fend off any attackers, who would mend them, who would reestablish them as God's land, and would help them flourish for all time. He uses a lot of different types of imagery, and some of which we have seen before. Again, especially if you're familiar with the book of Revelation. So he talks about the sort of the image of a branch and a tree, a golden lampstand and olive trees, a flying scroll. He talks about some imagery of 4 chariots, and he mentions specifically the image of a chariot with red horses and a chariot with black horses and with white horses. And of course, if you've read any of Revelation, that horse imagery with the different colors should really show you, something. These symbolic crowns, horns, hearts, that's all of these different things. And again, I encourage you to actually read these, but I'm only trying to give you a kind of a sense of the context of the book. A lot of the imagery that we see in Zechariah are things that, if we've read Revelation or something else, we have seen before. So a lot of that imagery is right here in this book. And so I think that alone, if you're someone who is intrigued by the book of Revelation and what on earth is happening, I think is worth your time. It talks about a coming peace and prosperity for the land, a judgment against other nations that have been against Israel time and time again. And then it gets to this image of the Messiah. And I think when I read it, you'll probably be familiar with it. So it's just a couple of verses. I'm just going to read those to you and then remind you, if you need it, remind you of where you've heard them before. So this is in chapter 9, verse 8. And it comes right after a little bit of time that there are different prophecies against different neighboring nations around Israel. And so in verse 8, it says this: "But I will camp around my house because of an army, because of him who passes by and returns. And no oppressor will pass over them any more. For now I have seen with my own eyes. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, the Messianic Savior King. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." A pretty clear sign of what this will bring. After all of this war and judgment and all of those things, here is the idyllic messianic king. One who is strong, one who will keep any oppressor away, one who comes in peace and justice and salvation and humility. Because look what he rides in on. He rides in on humble animals. And if you're still trying to piece together why I'm saying this, if you remember, if you've ever been in church on a Palm Sunday, you'll remember that there's a reference, a very clear reference made to why it is that Jesus comes in and makes sure he gets an untied donkey and colt, right? He rides in on Palm Sunday into Jerusalem in this very humble way. And then there's even a quote of a passage saying, this is why he's doing that. This is the passage that they reference. And so the rest of the book talks a little bit about what this Messianic king will do. And if you spend a little time in it, you'll find that there's a few other nuggets of things that scholars at the time would have used to try to prove that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, and a couple of the references, if I can find it. So this book talks about a couple of different things that we associate with Jesus. So let's see here. His lowliness is in chapter 6, and humility we just read. His rejection and betrayal with 30 pieces of silver is found in chapter 11, verses 12 through 13. It's a vague reference to the crucifixion, which is that this king will be struck by the sword in chapter 13. His priesthood in chapter 6. His kingship, obviously, and his coming in glory, which is found in chapter 14, verse 4. So a lot of the case for Christ being who he is to all of us, a lot of that comes here. Now, that may not mean a whole lot to you and I, but you can see why it would mean a whole lot to those at the time. If you are going to take the dangerous action, and it would have been dangerous to go from being of the Jewish tradition to the Christian tradition. It wasn't called Christian yet, but it was called the people of the way. If you're going to make that transition, you better be right. It better be worth all of the heartache and pain that it was going to take to leave something that was stable and something that your ancestors and their ancestors had believed in and known their entire lives, and somehow taken this different path when it, which meant following Jesus and going away from that. You would need to be really sure that who you were following was the real deal. And so different books of the New Testament spend a lot of time trying to make sure that people were aware of that. If you think about the book of Matthew, Matthew spends a lot of time in a genealogy, in a history of Jesus, connecting him, Jesus, to David. If you think about the book of Hebrews is written to people who had converted from Judaism to Christianity. And a lot of that book is connecting Jesus to who they were expecting in the Messiah that was going to make everything right. He didn't do that work in the way they expected, but he does it in this different way. So if you're at that time, connecting Jesus to something that had always been hoped for was a huge deal. So the way I want to end this is just by reminding us of why books like this are important. We see prophecy like this, these apocalyptic writings, these revelations about what will happen in the end. The ones that are included in Scripture are there for very specific reasons and at very specific times. They don't come haphazardly. Daniel is written in the midst of exile, one of the darkest and lowest times that the people of Israel had faced for centuries and centuries. They were slaves in Egypt, but at that point they didn't have a promised land that they were taken from. But they were slaves in Egypt, and they had lost their identity, and for much of their time in Babylon, I'm sure it felt much the same. And this revelation of Daniel was a sense of hope that things would turn and that God would make things right at a time that seemed very dark, a time that they really needed transition. And then that transition happens. They go back. Somehow they're able to go back. And then Zechariah has kind of piggybacks off of that revelation of Daniel by adding his own. And the imagery is bold, and it has a deep kind of metaphor to it, and he explains some of that in the writing. And so all of that is there as an encouragement that we are now back, and the hope that Daniel gave us has come, but now we are those who can help move that forward towards where God is going. And of course, in the end of the New Testament, we have that at a time of great peril, where it looks like everything is going to be lost. The temple does get destroyed, and if it's destroyed, then maybe all of us, our people, our history, our nation, our faith, all of that might go along with it. And so the revelation is a source of hope. And I like being able to think about and look at what was happening at the time when these things are written, and when they're read by people who really needed them in a very particular time. And we get to be those who glean something from that. I think if nothing else, in the studying that we've done of the Old Testament, I hope that it gives you a sense of place, that it gives you a sense of, we can read these books and just try to get something out of them cold. But if we understand the world in which they are crafted and the people that they're crafted for and what's happening for them at the time, I think it adds a lot more to it. I think we understand our faith better. I think we understand Jesus better. And I think we understand, the people, our ancestors in faith who came before us and what their journey was like and how it leads us to where we are now. So I know that this one was a little bit longer. I know that I've gone over my normal amount of time, but I appreciate you spending a little extra time with me as I try to unpack that a little bit. I know it's an overused term, but unpack that a little bit and break it apart. I hope you go back to those different books and see how the story kind of weaves together when you do. So I think I'll end there, and I'm going to end kind of with a prayer, looking to God for hope and to meet us where we are, wherever that happens to be. So let's pray together. God of love and compassion, we thank you that we can have the time and the space to explore the world that came before us, and how that allows us to reimagine our lives today. We thank you for bold writers who took your message and tried to share it with the world so that people would have hope and they would have a sense of place and they'd have a sense of expectation, that there was a plan for them, a plan for us. And so we thank you for the scriptures and the way that they lead us and guide us. I thank you for those who are willing to give of themselves to learn a bit more of it. And let us move forward with humility and compassion, caring for the other first, before we care so much about just ourselves. Thank you for your presence with us. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, folks. I'll see you next time. Thanks.